Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for inviting me to join you on this farm day in which we're not on the farm. So I'm hoping really soon that I can join you on the farm together. But in the meantime, from the Zoom box, I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainable agriculture on a landscape scale. So generally, when we think about sustainable ag, we're thinking about the farm and what we're doing, all the wonderful things that can be done. But I'm going to talk a little bit about habitat connectivity, which Ames touched on a bit with his corridors, as well as like diversifying the landscape for key ecosystem resilience, particularly with a lens toward rapid changing climate. So we'll cover what is habitat connectivity, as well as a little bit about climate-wise connectivity through a case study from the Miacamas to the Berryessa, which some of you are familiar with that area. Those in the Napa, Sonoma area will know this region. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some research results that have to do with birds and bats. So fitting with the theme today, the avian experience, as well as hopefully leave you with a few things that we can all do together to promote biodiversity conservation in a working landscape. One of the things that has fostered the interest in habitat connectivity is the rampant loss of habitat and habitat fragmentation. So what's happening here is that as the native vegetation patches shrink and become disjunct from each other, we need to reconnect them. So basically, so that wildlife can roam across the landscape. And for some species, it's actually critical to have large continuous areas of habitat for them to persist and to prevent extinction. The other thing that we know is going on is climate change. And one of the things that we're thinking about with habitat connectivity, it is actually one of the leading proposals for how to adapt to climate change for biodiversity conservation is maintaining and enhancing habitat connectivity. That is because species are on the move with climate change. They're often forced to move from their existing current habitat to that is increasingly becoming unsuitable for them to persist in that space, and being forced to move to new places, right? That the habitat is more suitable into the future. And because of these required shifts in the distribution of these species, we need to be thinking about how to make the landscape more permeable to allow for these shifts. So for that reason, there's sort of the two main aughts of maintaining and enhancing habitat connectivity. And those are the habitat loss and fragmentation, as well as the importance of shifting ranges under climate change. And the ways that folks do this is they usually implement a habitat corridor or even a large landscape linkage, as well as make the matrix between habitat patches more permeable for wildlife to be able to move. And why would they want to do that? Well, to improve the ability of species to move just in their daily movements, to increase the gene flow between populations that are in isolated habitat patches, to allow for seasonal migration, as well as I mentioned, the facilitation of range shifts. And the goal, though, the ultimate goal is to increase the population viability of these species in the wildlands, as well as across the working landscape. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, to increase the climate resilience of our ecosystems. There are different ways in which people tackle this problem. And I'm just showing you here a couple of examples of how climate scientists and conservation scientists see the landscape when they think about climate-wise connectivity. In a standard formulation of connectivity, we think about a corridor as being sort of what's the shortest pathway that we can maintain between two natural areas, like natural area A on the left, connected to natural area B on the right. And you might think, well, we just want to put the corridor into the shortest pathway, which is the standard corridor across. But in thinking about climate and how species move through climate space, it may be that species need to stay in their suitable climate habitat to allow them to persist. So they may actually take a circuitous route that allows them to move through sort of climate friendly areas rather than directly across, which may require them to, may not even allow for movement across very different climate types. So that's one strategy that we think about, is following suitable climate types rather than just the shortest path. The other thing that scientists think about, in many of you too probably observe, if you're working in a Mediterranean climate, where do you see wildlife? And you generally see those, especially during our dry season, in riparian areas. So through the heat of the summer and fall, riparian areas are very attractive for wildlife movement. And that's another strategy for maintaining climate-wise corridors, is to think about these cool refugia, including riparian. My screen is going around a little bit. Let's see if we can get it to work. All right. I'm going to just talk a little bit about our local case study. For those of you who are local enough in Sonoma, my Activist to Berryessa Coast Ranges project was started, really spearheaded by Pepperwood Preserve. And Ames talked about Pepperwood as a neighbor of his own vineyard, a great science and conservation institution, very community-based. And the goal was to create climate-wise corridors with land managers. And the process was a 2-year project timeline. I don't have time to talk about all the amazing meetings and field days we had together, but basically we're working with land managers, land trusts, to develop this concept of basically to plan and ultimately implement climate-wise connectivity. Our sort of our operating principle in this project was thinking about permeability of the landscape. So on the left, you're seeing a highly, what we would consider for wildlife as a highly permeable landscape. On the right, not so much, right? Very difficult for species to move through an intensely built environment. With that principle in mind, we used, on the left, we mapped our study area, and you're looking at the whole study area. It's quite a large area spanning from the Bay, San Francisco Bay, all the way up north, right through parts of Mendocino County and the Bureau of Land Management, a lot of land up in that area, up into Lake County too. All right, so we took an approach, a two-pronged approach. Normally and consistently, people who work on habitat connectivity think about terrestrial habitat, and of course we did as well, and we mapped this high permeable landscapes as compared to low permeable landscapes based on the amount of development in the land. It was the land managers in particular who really insisted, and I think rightfully so, that they really wanted to also look at riparian connectivity. And really focus that as a high priority and objective for the project. So we did a rather elaborate approach at that that I could talk to you offline about. But on the right, what you're seeing is our estimates of permeability related to the amount of riparian, intact riparian vegetation that remains in the landscape. And there are different areas that have highly permeable riparian landscapes as compared to just highly permeable terrestrial landscapes. So these are very different locations that become a priority. We use a least cost path algorithm. Basically, you're just trying to use the computer to find the path that is the most permeable between any two patches of protected lands. And you end up with a lot of least cost paths between different patches of all the protected areas, which are in gray here. The other thing I want to point out about this project is paying attention to the fact of the topography, our proximity to the Pacific Ocean, as well as our climate here in California. It was really important that we address summer temperatures differently than winter temperatures. So in working in climate change, often you'll hear a lot about the annual temperature rises, annual average temperature rise, which we know we've gone through a 1°C rise here in the mid latitudes. We've gone through a 2 to 3°C rise already up in the poles. But what we're thinking about when we're thinking about California is what's happening in the summer and what's happening in the winter. And the reason is because the changes that we're going to see, so the places that are going to get hotter into the future in the summer are different than the places that are going to get warmer in the winter, right? And as growers, I know you understand like the importance of winter minimum temperatures and how those are rising. So we're basically getting warmer winters, but we're getting warmer winters, even warmer in different places than we're getting warmer summers. And anybody who lives in this area knows that when it's summer, you want to go to the beach to cool off. But actually in the winter, if you want to get colder, you're going to go up into the high montane areas and up into northern latitudes. So those are different directions. So the way we're looking at linkages and temperature in this project is to ask the question, between any two protected areas, what is the sort of climatic advantage to linking them? So are the two patches really different climatically or really similar? If they're really different, then linking them provides like an added benefit of climate, right? Particularly we're interested in access to cooler climes. So we're warming the climate overall, and we want to make sure that species can access cooler climates so the corridors can facilitate their movement into these cooler spaces. And that actually can be calculated for every single linkage that we map for the project. You can actually look at the climate space of one protected area, the climate space of its adjacent protected area, and calculate the difference between those two climate spaces. And that's what we did. And what you're looking at here is the climate advantage of different small linkages across the whole study area in the winter and in the summer, because remember that they're different. You'll see that the climate advantages of linking protected areas in the winter is up in our montane regions as compared to linkages that provide summer cooling. That's trying to move species more and more from east to west or toward the ocean cooling influence. All right. The important part about this project is that we did bring it down to the local level, looking at parcel level information. So this is just Pepperwood to the south and Modini, Miacamas Preserve to the north. So now we're basically zooming into two protected areas and asking the question, what is the permeability between these protected areas at the parcel scale? So we just average the values of permeability for terrestrial permeability and for riparian permeability, which is on the right. And we can do that average for every single parcel. And that really brings it home, right? Like, working with the landowners on these particular parcels. And I want to mention that the parcels that have very low permeability, they're sort of browner on the left, those have low terrestrial permeability, but because of the road system that's in those parcels, but they actually have really high riparian permeability. So if you're familiar with this area, you'll know that's going on. So I think it was important that the land managers suggested we do both terrestrial and riparian permeability because there's different results for different parcels, which leads to different management solutions and different focus for the different parcels. There's things that everyone can do, even if your parcel is not on this map, to promote connectivity. And the team at Pepperwood and all the folks and land managers that worked on this project also put together a nice brochure about 7 ways to keep your lands wildlife friendly and things you can actually do. I'll talk about those more at the end, but there was definitely like a lot of outreach around this project. So some of the salient findings from this particular work is the importance of developing a community vision for connectivity. People really all need to get behind the idea of having a corridor and protecting a corridor and acting upon it. That if you're working in this part of the world in Mediterranean climates with ocean influence, don't rely on annual average temperatures to sort of do your planning. Think about winter and summer as being separate climatic dynamics. And really need to get down to the parcel scale when we do this type of work. There's a lot of conservation science that's done at a much coarser scale, but if you really want to work with landowners, obviously they're managing in the parcel. So I'm talking about sustainable ag on a landscape scale, but I'm recognizing that actions are taken at the parcel scale. It's avian day, so I will not disappoint. Let's do some birds real quick. Actually, this data is most recent, so I'm sharing it with you, but it's actually from Chile. However, when you're in the Chilean vineyard landscape, you can sometimes just squint your eyes a bit and you feel like you're in California. It's not that different. And Andres Munoz, who is a PhD student in my lab and is now at the University of Chile in agroecology, did a really neat study where he actually surveyed birds in the wildlands around these Chilean vineyards and looked at what birds do you find in the wildlands? How are the wildlands serving to support biodiversity that can be found in the vineyard? And what's found in these remnant single trees and riparian, sort of remnant spots of vegetation within the vineyard. I'll make that a little clearer, hopefully. All right, so 120 survey stations. That's what's important about this slide. There's Andres in not such easy terrain to move around, doing some birding, and he's got a bat monitoring station there as well. And these vineyards are placed on a gradient between like a very dominant vineyard landscape as compared to a more wildland dominated landscape as far as the surrounding landscape. And again, the data was taken from inside the vineyards, from at the location with these little fragments, so single trees and little clusters of vegetation that were retained in the vineyard, as well as in the wildlands. And then that, they call it matterhorn there, but it's like our scrublands. All right, so take home from this study is that the remnants, he found almost all of the species biodiversity, not every single species, but most in the remnants, as well as, of course, in the wildlands, and not so much when he was surveying in the vineyard itself. So just for bird conservation, those remnants really can serve as sort of stepping stones for connectivity through the wildland landscape. He also found, as you might expect, that the wildlands do influence the probability of finding a bird in a vineyard. So a very dominant vineyard landscape on a really large scale is going to have fewer species than the intermixes of woodland, shrubland, vegetation along with vineyards. But anyway, this is an argument for keeping some remnant vegetation inside the vineyard. I don't know how many people are aware that bats can actually eat like 6,000 to 8,000 insects a night. So we've been talking about the nice like pest services, pest control services that wildlife can provide. And I hope we can, maybe someday we'll have a bat day. But anyway, habitat diversity promotes bat activity in the vineyard landscape. And I'm talking about work that was done by Rochelle Kelly and Justin Kitsis in my lab, looking at bats and vineyards, and just briefly, same kind of idea, surveying vineyards. In this case, there were 21 vineyards surveyed, and it was paired, like these stars show you, between sampling bats acoustically along the edge of the vineyard near a remnant vegetation, and inside like the heart of the vineyard where there was no remnant vegetation. So we specifically chose vineyards that were not retaining a lot of like nectaries and vegetation stuff. This is a very sort of like simplified system of it's just simple vineyard versus edge remnant. And similar to what we found in Chile, we see that on the left bars, you have the vineyard interior sampling. And on the right is the remnant vegetation. Sorry, the scale of this photo isn't that great for you, but the bars that you see, the higher mean lines, suggest that for two out of the three species I'm showing you here, remnant vegetation resulted in greater detections of bats. And then this upper left graph shows that for all the species we were able to detect with the bat acoustic monitoring, the remnant vegetation had much higher detections. So also for bats, maintaining native vegetation, shrubs and trees in and around the vineyard is highly valuable. And these guys, they really eat lots of insects. So that's a good thing for growers. We're on to what we can do and questions. So what we can do, protect natural areas from being converted. This is first and foremost, is we actually just need to stop clearing native vegetation in California. I'll speak to the place I know. when it's been cleared, we can try to maintain and restore native vegetation in and around the vineyard, and also manage water. I didn't talk about water today. We don't have a lot of time, but if we can reduce the demand from the vineyard on subsurface and surface flow in the summer, that would really help both aquatic wildlife as well as terrestrial wildlife, because we were talking about the importance of those riparian areas. Minimize fencing and use wildlife-friendly methods wherever possible. That's another really great way to make the landscape more permeable to wildlife movement. And the lighting issue is important as well. And that's super simple. Just minimize nighttime lighting, downcast lighting. I can't tell you how many wineries I've gone by have like full floodlights on. And it's like, we really don't, I hope we don't need to do that, or at least consider wildlife in lighting. I just want to say thanks to Pepperwood. It's an awesome job with the MTB project, as well as everyone that's come through my lab. I don't collect any of this data myself, so thanks to a cadre of students and postdocs and a great science group on climate change. Really, most of what I know about climate change, I've learned from TBC3, which is a group that connects through Pepperwood. So that's all I have for you today, and thank you.